All right. Well, it's interesting that we're talking about sports because there's psychological research that actually shows that people root for their political party in much the same way that they root for their football team. Mr. Sperling, I'd like to start with you.
As a Detroit Lions fan, I will say in politics, my team does occasionally.
Chicago fans can empathize.
Not as much as.
So, is it possible? What is Moneyball for government, and is it really possible to transport this model from sports into government?
I think it can. I think that what you want is that in politics too much right now, things get too almost just knee-jerk ideological. And you want to bring people into a discussion. I think what happens a lot of times is that, you'll have an offsite, you'll be at a think tank, people will be talking about the issue, and then there'll be, the sense of, well, why can't we ever do this in Washington? And so I think what you have to hope is that the focus on what works actually takes you out of, for a second, the normal kind of almost ideological triggers of, is this a tax cut? That means somebody's for it. Is it a spending increase? That means somebody's against it. And start looking at particular problems, particular issues. I think one of the challenges that you'll have on both sides of it is that you have to overcome is the following. I think the way that the evidence can play into the normal fight is that progressive Democrats will feel, boy, we've worked really hard to get this investment in a progressive cause. And, we can't, it's so difficult to get anything. Now that we've got it, we can't admit that there's some challenges or problems because on the whole, it's probably still helping people. And it probably still is. Maybe not efficiently, but it may still be. And then on the other side, not having conservatives who want smaller government to necessarily say, aha, we see that this program's not working, therefore that's proof that this is an area that we can just cut for deficit reduction. What you want to need is to get a certain commitment that there are certain issues that we want to deal with. And then a willingness, a trust that we're actually going to look at the evidence and see what works best. Now, just a little example, but an interesting one was when we came into the government in 1993, there were training programs for low-income youth, but they weren't working that well. And we had a really brilliant economist, Larry Katz, Harvard, as our chief economist, and he had an incredibly insightful thing based on evidence, which is that Congress spreads these grants so thin that the few kids here and there get options. Well, guess what? It turns out that kids need a peer group. If you're going to leave, a gang or leave some kind of illegal activity and go be part of some training program, you are going to lose a lot of friends. You need a group of friends. So the idea was that it doesn't work to spread it out. Now, what does work is that if you fund enough in particular places where a strong peer group can get together and all take a different path, that works. Well, that was an interesting insight, and we actually did try to change that program that way. But then when the '94 Congress came in, there was such an emphasis on cutting, it never happened. Now, some people would say, oh, that was a great example of us using evidence. Others would say, no, that showed how you weaken support for an existing program. So I do think it takes a trust. Progressives have to trust that if they're willing to acknowledge a program is not working best, that there's going to be a willingness on the other side to then figure out what does work best, and that the evidence is not just one more tool for people to argue about whether they're for big government or smaller government, and instead that there's a commitment, we ought to be doing something about child poverty, we ought to be doing something about workers being displaced in their 50s, and let's look for the best evidence, and if we find it, let's have a commitment to do something about it. So you still have a big trust gap that you have to close for this evidence-based approach to really take hold.
I want to ask you too, because you've both worked in government, for some examples of ways in which you've actually used data to make government better. Madam Mayor?
Well, we are using data every day, and first of all, I want to thank the IOP and certainly Results for America for this opportunity to join this panel. And when you look at the deployment and the use of data for decisions in government, I think we have a responsibility to our citizens to use it in the best way. And I say that because we all know that resources are dwindling. We are forced with fewer and fewer resources. From our perspective in Gary, we in 2012 were faced with a 45% reduction in our property tax revenue the day we went into office. And so the question is, how do you still become, how do you still ensure that you're delivering services to people? Because that's what they expect you to do. They don't want to hear the sad song about the reduction in revenue. And so you look at where the evidence supports the utilization of those resources. And for us, we first used it in fighting crime. And so we looked at the hotspots. We teamed up with Indiana University for them to do an analysis of how we could deploy officers in a way that it made sense and made them the most efficient. It didn't mean that we didn't serve other areas of the city, but it meant that we understood where most of our calls were coming from and how we might be positioned or position our officers to meet those calls in a much more effective way. The second area is an area that is ongoing, and we actually did it in partnership with the University of Chicago students at the Harris School when we were really trying to get our arms around the volume of abandoned houses, bless you, in the city of Gary. And so we decided that we would use a local data survey that had actually been prepared for Detroit, but that they agreed to adapt for our use in the city of Gary. And we were able to take that survey and actually look at all of the abandoned parcels in the city of Gary, all the parcels actually, not just the abandoned ones, and determine where the volume of abandoned houses were, where the volume of abandoned property, where the structural blight was, where the non-structural blight was, and it has allowed us to determine how we will use what are limited sources, both from federal and state government, for demolition, for deconstruction, but also for the utilization of green infrastructure.
And to connect that a little bit to like a real world outcome, how does being able to allocate, say, the demolition, the green infrastructure, what does that ultimately change in the city for the better?
It changes the quality of life. I mean, you know, because at the end of all of the theories about public policy are people. You know, are the lives of people. And just before I left City Hall, I had a brief conversation with a citizen who said that she was living in a block where there were 6 abandoned homes. She gave me the addresses. And so I was able to tell her, as a result of the work that we're doing, we are working on this problem with our hardest hit fund money. These are the properties that have been identified for demolition, but in addition to that, because of the use of data, we're also able to slate the other 3 properties for demolition. And, you know, she talked to me about the fact that she and her grandchild leave home at 5 in the morning. And the last thing you want to think is that someone is going to jump out or that you're in danger because of all of these abandoned homes. And the thing that always adds insult to injury from my perspective is that if I'm the house in that block and I'm taking care of my property and I'm a good citizen, the least that my mayor and others who are in government can do is honor my sacrifice and honor my commitment to the city. And I call those folks legacy residents.
So ultimately you're cutting down on squatting, you're cutting down on fire risk,
Absolutely.
and those sorts of
Absolutely.
real quality of life. Yeah. So Professor, can you talk, I mean, CompStat is famous, but can you talk about something else in New York or in Indianapolis?
Well, yeah, let's, I mean, you've got the Moneyball fellows in front of you, and there's probably 100 examples in the first 2 rows, or people can buy my book and there's another 100 examples over there. So let me think, I think the way you asked me the question is interesting. So you know, my work is mostly in cities, and cities have been using data to measure performance since, you know, famously CompStat in New York City and Commissioner Braden at the time. I think what we're talking about now, just to kind of weave these together, is a little bit different, right? It's how to look at all the new technology tools that we can do, the mining the data across the vertical agencies, right? It's how to distribute information to field workers through ubiquitous mobile devices, right? It's how to combine cloud computing. And what we're thinking about now, right, is how one uses data to solve, I think, 3 major problems. One is that cities are organized vertically, but people live horizontally. Like they live in a neighborhood in Gary. They don't live in the police department or the parks department. And so and Eugene kind of mentioned this when we talked about systems in which kids live, right? So looking at the data across the agencies in an organized way, that's what you know, New York City is doing so well now under its mayor. Is what Chicago is probably the leader in the country in thinking about data analytics for predictive purposes systems. Second is, you know, CompStat was very good at measuring activities. The more advanced work today is predicting a problem and solving it before, right? So where is the next fire going to occur? What conditions lead to the next child being battered? What interventions make a difference for that child who is going to be battered, right? So if we think about having too few resources, like every city in America, to solve its problems, then we need to repurpose the dollars to where they make a difference and anticipate those problems. And then I think lastly, and particularly in this environment, to me, one of the most exciting things is that we have public, and this is, I want to be careful not to agree to too many things in my panel to say for fear that I will look truly bipartisan. But we think about it in the following way, that, you know, progressive has 2 different senses. One is progressive government in the way we make government, and the other is progressive in the results of government, right? And one of the things I saw in New York City, and many may want to have rebuttal, but is that the command and control hierarchical systems that emanated from Tammany Hall have made sure that the way we prevent the abuse of discretion is by eliminating the discretion for public employees. So it's just very difficult for them to be problem solvers. So now what I think is exciting, so that means that you really have progressive government producing not so progressive results, right? So if we can we can reintroduce discretion in the public workforce. We can do it with the aid of data that says, here's how you should exercise your discretion, here's how we'll monitor the use of your discretion. You can intervene more effectively in the life of a child or preventing a pothole or whatever, then we've created more excitement in the public service and more satisfaction. So just kind of all together, hundreds of examples of how we're using data, but the most exciting way is to improve the discretion and predict problems in advance and then solve them.
So this gets into some of what I want to talk about, because it'd be too boring just to keep talking about the successes. Let's talk about some of the challenges. And you know, Philip Howard has been talking about discretion for a long time. You know, I talked to this new state treasurer of a pretty big southern state, and he'd come over, he was a vice president of a big bank, and he said, okay, we'll get everyone in, we'll order some sandwiches and talk. And they were like, oh, no, you can't have sandwiches. No, only sandwiches with overtime. And that kind of like, this level of the terror that at somewhere a public employee might be having an illicit sandwich. And every time it seems that people push a little bit in that direction, it gets snapped back because some idiot in some department somewhere ordered 900 sandwiches and gave them out to their friends. How do you increase the discretion in the face of that kind of political pressure? And can I ask all 3 of you to talk about that?
Well, which end do you want to start? Well, let me make one just follow-on comment, and then my esteemed panelists can kind of correct me. I think there's a couple ways to think about this. All due respect, I think innovation is pretty much illegal inside New York City government. Not because of the mayor, right, but just because there are 2,000 job classifications and there are 200, what? I worked in a different administration. It was an accusation, right, yeah. But it's not political. It's not a comment about the mayor. It's the fact that you have hundreds of consent judgments. You have 2,000 job classifications. You got 200 labor unions. You got people pinned in little boxes, and you have swarms of lawyers telling you what you can't do. Right. So we have to improve that discretion. But just one really quick example. Right. So I had this discussion with a health commissioner because I was going out to see small restaurant owners and small retailers in different boroughs because I'm not from New York and I was trying to get to learn their problems, and I kept running into restaurateurs who said we're getting these $500 to $1,000 fines for silly things like our cheese is 2 degrees too warm, right? The cheese is supposed to be 42 and it was 43 degrees. So I went back and asked the health commissioner, could we just exercise a little discretion for these guys? They don't have that much money, right? They're not like big Manhattan restaurants, they're little guys in the Queens. To which he said, well, do you really want that? Because once we introduce discretion, how are you going to control the discretion? How are you going to know who's going to abuse their discretion, whether or not they'll be corrupt? Well, the answer is they all have iPads or Android tablets, right? We know where they are. We know how long they're in each restaurant. We know how many tickets they've written for what type of thing. We can manage their production. We can manage the outliers. Their managers, their supervisors can do it. So I think we can begin to change the rules to allow the discretion and have a new sense of accountability and one that's outcome driven instead of process driven.
I certainly agree with that approach. I think the idea is, one, you have to have people who are not limited by what government can't do. One of the things that we set out to do at the beginning of our administration was to, one, attract local talent back to the city, and two, to get people out of the private sector who didn't have a perspective about what the limitations were of government. And so they wouldn't be able to say, well, I can't do that because this rule. Now, I'm not saying that I have encouraged them to break all of the rules or to ignore the rules, but what I have encouraged them to think about is, what is the best solution to this problem, whatever that problem is, and how do we achieve or reach that solution in the confines of whatever laws or ordinances govern the work that we do. The two are not mutually exclusive. You just can't be limited in your thinking by the rules and the regulations. You have to think it through and then understand that the solution that you come up with has to be within the confines of those rules and regulations, unless you determine in trying to come up with that solution that the rules and regulations need to be changed. And then you go about the business of making those changes, not arbitrarily, but based on the need to be responsive in government.
Mr. Sparling, do you have any thoughts on this? Is it easier to do at a small level, like Gary, and as you go up, you get more consent degrees, you get more sort of sclerosis of a large system?
Oh, we have our share of consent decrees.
Well, I think you're actually, I think this is important in another way too, because I think this rightly expands what the discussion of being results-oriented be. So a certain amount of the discussion that's in the book, et cetera, is more about how do you take a major intervention, you know, a certain Head Start initiative or a certain training initiative, and you do a randomly controlled experiment on them, and then you try to decide, oh, this program we know looks like it has good results, this doesn't. But what this discussion goes to is that there's another type of results too, which is that there is a certain degree that you want people to be able to solve problems, that, you know, where there's a focus on being results oriented, and that a certain amount of limitations on government, perhaps put in to stop a particular abuse, prevent that from happening. And I think that's really is an important issue, and I think that there is a bit that this discretion or problem solving is maybe not results in the way of like a random control study, but it is, you know, not to be like the people in the movie who are saying, you know, bring that guy up from the majors because he's, you know, I like the way his girlfriend looks, and, you know, or something like that. But but that there are certain problem solves that you see that people should be able to fix. If somebody, and so I think you hit the point pretty well. I think that you like, what sometimes is more attractive about a story of a nonprofit or reading Walter Isaacson describing Steve Jobs is the sense of people just refining and refining and refining. And I think that you probably do need in government to give people more of a sense that there is a bit more discretion when you are results oriented. Now that gets controversial, and you hit it on the head. You have to have a certain amount of tolerance for error, and a tolerance that if you give a bit of discretion, somebody's going to use it poorly. But you do cost-benefit analysis. You think on the whole, that makes sense, and that what I think is frustrating or hurts innovation is the sense that people, find themselves in a situation where they go, wow, I'm doing this after-school program, and this person's doing a transportation program, and this person is doing a middle school program, and wow, I have a feeling that if the three of us work together, we could get kids in safe places to after-school programs that are working, but our funding isn't allowed to be associated with the school's not allowed to do something with after school. And I think those are the type of, that's, I think is kind of a different type of discussion, but I think it's very important because I think it goes to the results oriented, where in a sense you almost don't need a randomized controlled experiment. 100 out of 100 people might agree that if you designed a program that was going to have poor kids meet at a particular corner to get picked up, and it turned out that if you don't have a police officer there, that just becomes the place where those kids get preyed on. Do you really need, what you need there is the flexibility to be able to work, to say, oh, let's have the police department and the transportation department and the Department of Education working on that together. So I think this is another important area, which is how do you give the people the flexibility to pursue results on kind of a day-by-day basis and do the kind of problem solving. And that's, I think, is an important avenue, and I think should be very much part of the Results for America type of mission, as much as the 5-year experiments.
Well, let's go back to the experiments, and one of the questions that I want to ask about the challenges are, we brought up Head Start. And Head Start comes from pilot programs that were conducted in the 60s and 70s that seemed to show good results. There's some argument about how well they were actually randomized controlled trials, but they show pretty compelling results in terms of everything from employment to reduction of teen pregnancy and incarceration. But there are a lot of people who argue that Head Start, which was based on those programs, basically doesn't show any of those results. And that all of the gains fade out very early, by 1st to 3rd grade. How do you deal with problems of scaling a controlled trial once you've done it? And how do you, because as these evaluations have come in from Head Start, nothing has happened, basically, right? So how do you, first of all, you have a promising pilot and then it doesn't scale up. How do you deal with that?
Jean talked about this earlier. I think that you really do have to make the commitment to make the investment. And it takes guts, because people will be critical. You can't just, there isn't an infinite amount of money, so you have to make a decision to invest in Head Start versus investing in something else, and so you're going to have to take money away from another area. We saw that, and I'll put on my drug court hat, in the issue of drug treatment courts. When we needed to scale up, there were some states that were willing to take money away from incarceration and invest in drug treatment courts. Those states have been successful. Those states have seen appreciable changes in recidivism, whereas those that say, well, drug courts are a great thing and just have boutique courts, or they don't scale and haven't made it something that is in all jurisdictions, have seen that they haven't met with those results. So you really do have to have the political courage to make the investment, and that that means that folks like me have to take criticism. You know, you have to say, I know that this will work. You have to hang with me for the long term with this, and you have to explain to folks what you're doing so that that type of transparency will buy you the time that you need to show the results.
Is there a risk, though, that you have created a constituency for a program that doesn't work and is now going to fight tooth and nail? What do you do about that, Professor?
Well,
how do you tackle that? Is there a way to mitigate that problem? I guess I should ask. You can't make it go away. But.
Each of your questions is less capable of being answered than the one. So two quick comments. I was involved in the first social innovation fund that President Obama did. I think Michelle was there working with us at the time. It was a $50 million fund designed to buy results, right? As contrast to the average government procurement, which is a highly prescriptive. And so it was a terrific idea on the president's part. It was curious at the same time, though, there were, Gene probably knows the exact number to the penny, but more than $5 billion spent on Head Start. And there were GAO studies showing the bottom 15% of those, leave out how many of them were, but the bottom 15% were just really bad, right? So, but they were protected by their constituency, right, of Head Start associations. The same is true at the local level, frankly. If you look at social entrepreneurs, that the existing nonprofit structure connected to the city council and the United Way group protects the existing organization. So, I mean, all I would suggest in answer to your question is you have to have a leader, like the mayor of Gary, who says we're going to demand results and set a standard for repurposing and recompeting. And even if you can't grow to scale and eliminate the whole thing, if you constantly cause at least more competition with clarity about the outcomes you're trying to buy, it at least presents an opportunity for results.
So, a couple things. I mean, this to me goes to the issue I raised initially, which is I think for evidence-based to work, you have to have some shared commitment that you want to deal with a problem. I don't find that the problem is a Head Start constituency or lobby, et cetera. I think that when it becomes a discussion, that if you admit error or weakness in 15% of the programs, that the response is going to be, let's cut the overall program by 15 or 20%, then people who believe in the larger mission are going to fight that. If you're going to repurpose that, then, and there's a commitment to doing that, then our politicians should do that, and every side should do that. So I think that, when you look at something like Head Start, what we know is that we know that quality early intervention have huge returns. Now, that doesn't mean that one particular way works. You learn and learn. I think one of the hard parts when we were in the Clinton administration was telling President Clinton that even though we had the money to hit his numerical goal, we weren't going to try to hit it. Because we had evidence that showed if we weren't paying Head Start teachers, if we weren't spending more on the teachers, it wasn't going to work. That was hard, but that was an example of evidence just reshaping. So I think that what you need is you need a national commitment to quality early childhood education, that we know this basically works. And then I think if you could agree that this is a worthy investment for our country, and that admitting error or weakness was going to be a cause for reform, then I think you would have more use of evidence and people would trust it. And, the examples that I use is, I'll just be, not polite in saying this. There's a terrible double standard against poor people in our country when it comes to evidence. There just is. My sister is on the faculty here. She is a professor of immunology at the University of Chicago. She works in the lab. She may fight over NIH funding, but people don't say, that immunology, that experiment didn't work. Well, let's just give it up. No, it's like, okay, well now what are we going to learn about that? You don't hear people saying, let's just give up on solving breast cancer because these 5 studies didn't work. It's just evidence in a shared goal to do that. Now, I have to say that when I hear the fade-out study, I mean, I can't be calm at that. You know, what's the fade-out study? That's like, it's D-Day, and your Navy performed beautifully at getting to shore, but your Air Force failed to give them cover once they got to shore. Conclusion, having a good Navy doesn't really matter. Of course not. Go to your sports analogy. You don't say, you know, the Detroit Tigers aren't sitting there going, we had great starting pitchers, but we had a bad bullpen. Well, so the benefits of starting pitchers faded out, therefore good starting pitchers don't matter? I mean, it's just, there's no other context in life that you would make that argument. If we invest in the poorest children of our country and we have better results going into first or second grade and they fade out, start asking what we're doing wrong in first, second, or third grade, obviously.
And I think to that point that evaluation, consistent evaluation is important. You know, you can say that Head Start works because we've seen that it does, but it doesn't work everywhere and every program doesn't work. And so we do have to make the commitment to consistently evaluate and to make changes where they're appropriate. Exactly. And a lot of times we say, oh, this is a great school, or this is a great program, and 10 or 20 years down the road, it's not a great school or a great program. Why is that? What do we need to change?
So let me ask one more downer question so we can start going into the upswing again, which is the measurement problems. And I actually want to, the first question I want to ask is just about things that are hard to measure, right? I mean, part of the challenge of big data is that you end up focused on things you have numbers for and possibly not things that are equally important that you don't. How do you try to incorporate that into a good Moneyball approach? You know, how do you allow for that?
Well, I think in my chapter, this was one of the things we tried to talk about, which is that it's not a light switch. And to stay with the light switch analogy, obviously the argument is that if you focus just on where there's results, you become the inebriated person who's looking under the light post for their keys because that's where the light is. That's where they can see. Right. So yes, I think you have to worry about that. You know, so for example, you can get a small intervention in a small area that works extremely well, but the more tougher, difficult issues may not be as subject to do that. So you can have two approaches. You can say, we're only going to expand where we have beautiful random control, 20-year experiments, or you can ignore that. And I'd say you try to go for a continuum approach. So it's not meaningless. It's not as good as a random control study. But if IOP spent a year examining what was happening at a nonprofit that seemed to be doing something good, really studying it, et cetera, that's a form of evidence. That would give you a bit more confidence in that program. It's not as good as a random controlled experiment, but if it's a pressing issue, you might want to know. And you'll find some interventions or nonprofits where their success is so overwhelming that even if there's some selection bias, I mean, I see schools where people are getting 90% of poor kids, or after-school programs that have 90% of poor kids going to college. I'm sure there's some selection bias, but the numbers are too great. So I think you try to go from, you get away from the hunch approach, and you say, you know, here are deep, difficult issues. You know, the things that might turn a kid when they're in middle school, that is very difficult issues, but they may be the most important issues. You find the policy intervention that takes an 8th or 9th grader and puts them on a path towards college or community college, or instead of a bad path. I mean, the savings, the humanitarian savings, the savings for generations, their children, their grandchildren, they're enormous. So this may be the most difficult thing. And so I think you have to have a commitment that you're going to be that person who is going to keep trying, keep studying, keep looking. And you can't just wait until you have a randomized controlled experiment, but you can try to get people to start funding those. In the meantime, you can start getting people to do very careful case studies. You can try to make sure you have the results of how that program's working, even if you can't totally control for there being some selection bias. So I think with evidence like anything else, you want to do the best you can. I think what Moneyball says is, let's have that commitment. If you can get policymakers feeling conscientious about evidence, questioning whether they're supporting a program based on one anecdotal piece of evidence. And then I think it's like a quality measure. You upgrade the quality as you can. But I think you don't want to just, measure how many times I kiss my daughter on the cheek and decide that love of a parent towards their child is unimportant because I can't quite measure it. Well, it's important. You don't want to just measure how many kisses on the cheek I give to her. People write books about what a good spouse is, and they write, and it's important, even if you can't totally prove it. I think what we have to do is use evidence the best we can to attack our difficult problems and not go the route that if I can't totally randomize it, if I can't totally figure it out, then I ignore evidence. It's a continuum, and I think that, to me, is the ethic of the Moneyball or the Results for America.
The other challenge I want to ask you about is the problem familiar to those of us from The Wire who are fans of The Wire, juking the stats. You have this with a lot of teachers, for example. I talked to Jim Manzi, who's an author of a book on doing RCTs in a whole bunch of fields, including policy, and he does this for companies and various institutions, and he said, you try to redesign a compensation system for your sales force, and suddenly, these people who kind of had an English major, suddenly they're like Aristotle, and they can tell you exactly what's wrong with everything in your compensation scheme and why the measurement isn't going to work, and they will cheat. They'll start shipping product and then it gets shipped right back at the end of the quarter. Whatever it is, whatever number you measure, you are going to get that number, but you won't necessarily get the thing that you are trying to get by measuring that number. And how do you?
I think that, again, when you understand that when you're dealing with numbers, when you're dealing with statistics, you're really dealing with people's lives. I'll give you a prime example, the unemployment statistics. Every time somebody comes to me and says that Gary's unemployment rate is 9% or 10%, I say, where did you get that lie? 10%? Have you counted the people who haven't started looking for a job or who never started? Did you count the people who stopped 5 or 10 years ago? That came from someone who is being paid to do an unemployment program who's really hiring folks like those of us in this room and getting us jobs. Well, it's pretty easy to get us a job, but when
I'm glad to hear that.
When you look at when you look at those people who have training challenges, who don't have a resume, who don't have employment history, but if you understand that those are the folks that we ought to be trying to help, then you begin to design programs, then you begin to look at data for them, and that has to motivate someone like me or someone at the unemployment agency who is entrusted with helping those folks. That has to motivate. So if I'm dealing with a 50% number, which is more accurate, as opposed to that 10% number, then maybe I'm more motivated to come up with something that is directed at the long-term unemployed.
Professor, and then I promise we're going to the optimistic session of the program. How big a problem is juking the stats, and what do we need to do?
Well, let's just make your question half full instead of half empty.
Okay.
Right? So whatever your measure, you're going to get more of than you really wanted, right? And even not even cheating on the crime stats, just producing more of it by however you manage your resources. But it seems to me that it's the process of measurement is an iterative process, and it's better to keep measuring it and correct for what you. Right. I mean, I had this conversation as a young mayor when I had a Notre Dame MBA as my transportation director, and I said, I'm going to measure how many potholes we fill per worker per crew per day. He said, you don't want to do that. I said, why don't I want to do that? That's exactly what I want to do. I'm going to hold these guys to performance. He said, here's what's going to happen. They're going to fill each of the potholes twice as fast, twice as poorly, and then they're going to go back and fill it again. And we're going to count that as twice. Is that really what you want, or do you want smooth streets, right? So a couple answers, suggestions on the half-full side. One is measurement is good and therapeutic and iterative, and we shouldn't get too caught up in the fact that it's going to be imperfect. Two is we're going to get more of it than we really want. Three, though, the most important issue, it seems to me, is to the extent that we use the Moneyball concept. I'm not very good at sports, so I want to watch out for the sports metaphors. But if we're trying to accomplish an outcome, you know, the outcome might be a win in baseball, but it might be a child's life saved in Gary, right? So the process of measuring the outcome as contrasted to measuring the activity, that in and of itself is productive. And then we can see how far we're getting. And there are these continuum of measurements. You know, you have matched pairs. We can do predictive analytics to figure out that this provider of this service to this child in New York City has done no apparent good compared to others, right? So each one of those is a kind of continuum of evidence, and the process is to determine an outcome. There's plenty of data to do it, and we ought to begin now and just keep changing it until we get it right.
So we now move on to the happy part of the program. What do we need to do this? What do we need more of? What do we need in terms of resources, in terms of training? What is it that needs to happen in order to make this vision a reality? And I'll start with Mr. Sperling and move down the line.
Well, I go back a little to what I said earlier. I mean, first of all, I agree. Look, everything in life is iterative, and you keep learning. And I think the problem with the debates we have a lot of times in Washington is it's like, we want to. If you want to invest a lot in early education, you seize on the Perry control study and you want to defend it. And if you think we spend too much money, you want to find it doesn't work. What you really want is kind of what you'd have in any situation where you just have constant learning, and part of what you're going to learn is that your measurement doesn't work perfectly either, and it's going to be because people screw with the stats or. Geez, I remember interviewing for a long time people who did amazing work in Kenya on trying to reduce AIDS through education in schools, and it was great. And after they'd spent a few years, it occurred to somebody, what if nobody's telling the truth on the surveys? So they got like 10 or 20 different of the people working on it to each take a kid on like a weekend somewhere amazing. So they became really good friends. So they learned what was really going on in their life and found there was zero correlation. Zero. So they had to change. All they could do was study whether you actually got a sexually transmitted disease or pregnancy. In other words, surveys didn't work at all. In a poor country, people telling, writing a survey about their sex life, give me a break.
I don't think poor country is the only place where people lie on those surveys.
But it was dramatic there. So, does that mean their effort was no good? Well, they go to the next level, and you just have to do that, and you have to think the process is good. I would say, I'll make one very specific point. My younger brother is kind of a local social entrepreneur hero. He runs the Mosaic Youth Theater Group of Detroit, and they raise as much money to take in as many kids as they can. Well, the University of Michigan person comes along and studies their group and finds out that 95% of their kids, African American kids, went to college after going in their program. But from their neighborhoods, 50% were dropping out of high school. Beautiful, but no controlled experiment, right? So, too bad he didn't do that. Well, if you're my brother, you're in Detroit, you're trying to raise money, you're trying to help real kids' lives. The idea that you'd be thinking, you know what, for these 200 kids who didn't get into the group because we didn't have enough money, you know what I really want to do is raise money to study them. That's not what you want. the people who are fighting poverty on the grounds to do. So I think one thing we should do is try to get the philanthropic, the foundation, the university world to come in and do those. Don't expect the people doing them themselves. It's not their fault. They're on shoestring budgets trying to survive. So I think one thing is that if we're committed to this kind of more serious evidence, let's not make the local heroes who are doing that the ones who have to bear that burden. That should be in the funding for policy grants. That should be things universities do locally, work together. I think that's one thing. And then secondly, I do think you want to build all kinds of evidence. I think it's extremely interesting to, or let me put it this way, I think it's not just about finding out this intervention worked. It is extraordinarily helpful to know how somebody who did a successful teen pregnancy prevention program, how they got started. What were the first 10 mistakes that they made? You know, they tried to do this, and then this didn't work, and then they realized they had to get the religious community people aboard. Why make everybody make the same mistakes? So what I'm saying is that I think the gold standard may be the perfectly randomized controlled study, but colleges, you know, schools like this can go out and do serious case studies, serious things about what worked, didn't work, and there's a lot of learning and evidence in there. So I would say, I think we need a commitment that goes pretty broad from colleges, philanthropic communities. You know, Gary Orfield used to, probably people know him, used to teach in Chicago. He used to take his class and they used to go out and interview and, you know, people on segregation issues. Schools can do this, great learning. You can help nonprofits who could never afford to do it. Then you can help your mayor know what works best and his people. So I would say that you should have this commitment, and it shouldn't just be just on the government, and it shouldn't be just on the people doing it. And it shouldn't just be gold standard or nothing. I think you need a continuum of evidence, and I think that is very helpful. And I can say in a policy, you know, if you're in a policy job like myself, that kind of in-depth analysis, not just the studies, which are great, but even the case studies, the analysis, what worked, what didn't work. I know, I'll just give one last example. I know for a fact that if you have a local training program, and I think Chicago's done a great job of that, that's more employer-based and driven, and you get the credentials and the employers acknowledge if you go through the training, they'll hire that. I know that works well. But knowing that works well doesn't necessarily tell us how in the government we encourage people to get from here to there. So having analysis of what people did, how they started, the process they went, these are also very helpful, not just knowing what the bottom line is, but how people got there, the mistakes they've made. So I think that should be part of the emphasis.
Best practices as well as measurement.
I think it's all evidence, and it's all about results, and there's different quality, and it's all useful.
I'm getting the signal that it is time to move on to Q&A so that you guys can start asking the questions. There's a microphone there. Anyone who's interested in asking a question can go line up at the mic and
wow.
Too close. We should try that out. I mean, I hear all the stuff on data and then the case study talking about it and how you go back and forth. But if you take a real-world example, a lot of discussion in education about the effectiveness of charter schools as opposed to traditional neighborhood schools. But when the Obama administration came in, they had a very successful Washington, D.C. program of scholarships going to a small number of kids, $7,500, and these kids were able to take it and do exceedingly well. Very popular, very successful. Arne Duncan and President Obama did their darndest to kill that program. They weren't quite able. So the question is, when you look at all of what you've been talking about, sort of how you use data to decide what to do, the larger political issue is, how do you persuade key decision makers to take a look at the data and do what's best, as opposed to What did the teachers' unions want? And that's what they did. Do you see my point?
Who is that a question for?
Well, for Mr. Sperling, anybody who's familiar with what was going on in the Obama administration at that time.
I'm not really that sure about what the particular. Are you referring to kind of the
DC voucher program?
The DC
Yeah, everybody knows about the DC voucher program. It wasn't vouchers, they were called opportunity scholarships. But they were $7,500. They were given basically to mostly African American kids from low-income families. So the socioeconomics was quite clear. And these kids were taking it and going to private schools and doing exceedingly well. And we're talking, spent an hour here talking, lost the mic. It's okay, I'll speak louder. We're spending an hour here talking about, I understand, looking at studies and how we should look at studies and whether they should be randomized and so forth, when the larger political issues seem to be, in many cases, whether you're looking at the city level in Chicago, whether you're looking at the national level, on the federal level, or the state level, the larger issue is the political issue, not the data.
I know the issue you're talking about. I don't think that issue is as clear cut as you suggest, but rather than debate that, I think that what you want is for the evidence to, evidence isn't going to kill all the politics, but you do hope that it gives an area to start having a discussion. I mean, when you talk about case studies, examples, for example, yes, people fight. I'm not going to go into the whole voucher issue, but the, charter schools versus non-charter schools. Well, it's helpful to know that there's a case, it's helpful to know that there's schools that are great that work. And then it's helpful to know that whether something's a charter or not a charter isn't in itself decisive, that's not the decisive thing. Evidence shows us that. Now, evidence shows us that, but we know some schools are extremely high performing. Some are charter, some are not. What can we learn about that? Why are some schools performing well? Some of that one's going to learn by doing careful study or see results. Some you're going to ultimately want to try to go to the gold standard of randomized controlled. And I think that evidence does play in. I think evidence does tear down the politics. Evidence puts people who are taking a position just for politics or ideology are on the defensive when the evidence is against them. It doesn't kill ideology, it doesn't end politics, but it's an important weapon against positions that are purely political, are purely ideological, and moves us in the right direction.
Next question.
Hi, I just want to thank you guys for a great panel. It's very insightful. So I guess over the summer I worked on a project where we were trying to detect political earmarks from congressional documents. And one of the things that I realized is that even though the data that we have out there is publicly available in machine readable format, it's still very messy and tough to deal with. So I guess my question is about once these models are built and once you have the data available, the models are built and the systems are in place, how do you sort of think about within local governments making sure that a lot of the insights are sustainable after after people in administration leaves? And I guess from a community of data scientists, how do you sort of approach the people in government or in these agencies to release their data, as well as make sure that they put the extra effort into making sure the data is available and ready to be analyzed, extracted for insights.
There are a package of issues in your question there, right? So one is that all local and state governments today, federal government as well, are committed to open data, but some actually mean it and some just check the box, right? And open data becomes usable, right, when it is in a format that not only lets sophisticated app developers manage it, but where broadly available data, well visualized, can be accessed by communities, right, for the whole range of kind of insights that would occur. And I think the Chicago model actually with Smart Chicago is a wonderful example because there is a sophisticated NGO intermediary between the city's open database and communities. Second, you know, Chicago, New York City, there aren't a lot of cities big enough to have pretty sophisticated data scientists in City Hall. That's a pretty unusual thing. And so the extent to which they're supported by outside groups, they're supported by philanthropy, they're supported by the private sector who's developing apps that make sense and the like will be helpful as well. And then, but I think in the end, your kind of sustainability question it can be addressed two ways. One, we're so far along now, it's just hard to imagine that a successor mayor or governor is going to say, we really don't want to pay any attention to data. So the more discoveries, the more it's built in. But, and this goes to a question that we had earlier, in the end though, it's really leadership. Is there an evaluation unit? Is there a data analytics center? Is it located close to the kind of power center of government? You know, is there a voice for using the data in a meaningful way? And then finally, and we haven't really mentioned it much today, but there's a lot of data in the community, right? The mining of the social media, the communication from the citizens, and that needs to be brought into that center as well. So it's very back and forth and networked, and the city, and Chicago again as a leader in this, is thinking about itself, its 311 center, as a platform as contrasted to just kind of a one-way call center.
Hi, is this on? Whatever, I'll just speak loudly.
Yes, it's on.
So before in the panel, you guys were talking about how some governments are more risk averse when it comes to investing in certain social programs and whatnot. So do you think that there's any potential for programs like Pay for Success and social impact bonds and, you know, the bridging together private and public investment? Do you think there's any potential for that to be a success and a way to bridge the gap between, you know, or to combat the problem of governments that are risk averse?
You know, I think as Megan started to say, you know, probably a lot of the restrictions, there probably was always some good reason behind them. It doesn't mean they operate well. I think one thing we tried to do a little bit as we looked at this issue, because sometimes we do have the ability, you know, through waivers. President Clinton allowed states to do waivers to experiment with welfare reform, et cetera. One thing you try to do in the waivers is you say, to the degree we have a restriction, why? What is it there? And can we just set that as the baseline? So I'll give you a perfect example. People worry in programs, Medicaid, programs for poor people, that if you take off the kind of federal restrictions, that people will do what's easiest. You know, if I tell you you can have the money, you might decide you're not going to really use it for people who have severe disabilities because that's expensive and difficult. And so, you know, so that's a legitimate goal. That's a legitimate understanding. So I think what we would try to do is to say, okay, what are we really worried about if we had discretion? And so if you said, so in our case, perhaps with Medicaid, we might say, we're worried you're going to drop coverage of people who are, you know, the worst off or the poorest. We don't want you to do that. But so we're gonna give you flexibility, but you have to show that you're not doing that. And if that's the real goal behind 15 different restrictions, let's just say that and then give you more flexibility above it. So I think that a lot of what you can try to do in the Pay for Success or giving more discretion at the state or local level is for people at the federal level to ask, what really are you worried about? And can you deal with that with a results-oriented? So here it is. We're not going to do these 18 different restrictions. It's just you're not allowed to serve less people with severe disabilities. That's kind of a result-oriented, and often the 15 different restrictions are just meant for that. So that's why I think you can give more discretion, still keep a results focus, but not have that discretion kind of go against what might be a major policy goal.
Anyone else have
No, only that I think social impact bonds are a big deal. I think performance contracting is as well. I think it's particularly where you see these mergers between, you know, nonprofits, venture capital, bankers. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The bigger question mark is how much a dent they'll make in traditional funding that needs to be kind of redirected as well.
That looks like our last question.
Thanks a lot. One of the cool things about Moneyball was that it not only impacted leadership and decisions at the top, but also what players did on the field. And so I guess I'm curious about the electorate and voters. How can big data be used to inform voters about some of the complexities and the difficulties of these decisions? What's actually happening? Is there big data that can be used to, you know, engage voters a little bit more and make things maybe more transparent equally throughout all communities? Just look here.
I think that's a great question, particularly given the level of disinterest that the electorate has in government, or not in government, but in politics and in participation. And so I think that our job, as those of us in leadership move more towards the utilization of data, is to also bring citizens along. So to make that data widely available to them, to translate it in a way that is understandable. I mean, you know, you can put the data out there, but if it's not easy to understand, then you've not done anything. But to really help people understand why my making a decision in a different way really does benefit them in the long run, and why they may not see it very quickly. It may take a year or 5 years or 10 years, but how it will ultimately be to their benefit. And I think there's a real opportunity to engage people if in fact we articulate it to them in a way that matters, and so you have to talk to them about why it impacts the way their garbage is collected, how it impacts the way that potholes are filled, how it makes their communities safer, ultimately how it improves the quality of their lives.
Other access? I mean, so we had a cartoon book of Obamacare. Maybe we need a YA novel and a reality television show for the sewer system?
Sure. I do think, you know, the question before was about information data. I do think the type of information government collects is really important for policy. And, you know, actually, the mayor was talking about whether the unemployment stats for Gary, Indiana are as accurate. But actually at the federal level, because of really great work done by academics and pressing government over times, we actually collect a lot of fine levels. And I actually think Janet Yellen, as chairman of the Fed, is able to make much better decisions because she doesn't just have to look at the unemployment level. She can look at, because, you know, so now we see unemployment's way down, but a lot of other factors are improving but still high. Wages, but also people working part-time who want to work full-time. We know what those numbers look like. So we get a much better picture. That can actually have a significant effect on Federal Reserve policy. Federal Reserve policy has a better sense of if there's slack, if they can let things be easier without having a risk of inflation. A lot of that ability to make wiser decisions is just based on having that information. So I think that is very important. And the other thing I'd just say is on this results-oriented, we talked a lot about kind of the government, you know, the government working like different parts of government having greater flexibility. But I do think in terms of involving communities, you know, one program that was done in '93, I was part of it, and was heavily evaluated, and was one of those ones that was evaluated as working sometimes and not working other times, was the empowerment zones. But here was the interesting things. Whether the tax incentives work perfectly, in cities where they used it to bring constituents together, not government, together, you had people for the first time coming together and saying, how can we solve our problems? So I think empowering that type of results, innovation, having government programs that allow for that flexibility, but allow other people to come in and be part of the problem solving, and maybe having people talk together who never talk together, can be very empowering. And whether the empowerment zone set of tax incentives work well, I do think that idea of having government grants that require the community to come together, even just the conversation itself can be empowering, and I think have results that go beyond the program itself.
And if I can just put in a plug for the government technologists, because I use a ton of government data from countries all over the world, and we could be doing better. But the United States is by far the best at organizing and presenting data for citizens. So be proud, Americans. We do one thing really right. And with that, I think we actually have to close. I see the hook coming out to drag us off stage.
Absolutely.
But thanks to our amazing panelists for doing such a great job.
Yeah. Special thanks to Stephen Goldsmith, Karen Freeman-Wilson, Mayor of Gary, Indiana, Gene Sperling, and Megan McCardle, our moderator. Thank you all so very much. If you have more questions, there is additional information about Moneyball for Government at the table to my far left. You can also download their new book, which Michelle mentioned earlier at the top of our conversation. And there's also Stephen Goldsmith's brand new book for sale as well, The Responsive City. We thank you all so much for being here. Special thanks to Michelle and the entire team at Results for America. Thank you for the great question from the audience, and have a wonderful evening.